It was 1956. I was 4. My mother had died in November, and they told me she was in heaven. It was a beautiful place, they said, and one day I would go there if I said my prayers and I was good. I wasn't sure I wanted to go to heaven. I knew it was a lot better than hell with all that fire and the devil poking you with his pitchfork. But would I be able to play with my friends or watch TV? I didn't think they had TV in heaven. It was a pretty old place, and we just got one last year. In heaven, they probably just sang all the time. It sounded boring. I was a very religious kid, though. I prayed in my bed every night. I went to Sunday school and church every Sunday. But there were some things I couldn't figure out, like dinosaurs. My dad gave me a book for Christmas with pictures of Tyrannosaurus Rex and lots of other dinosaurs. The book said these giant creatures had roamed the earth millions of years ago. But why were there no dinosaurs in the Bible? There were sheep and goats and oxen, but no Tyrannosaurus Rex. In 4th grade, I learned about evolution. My teacher said there was somebody named Charles Darwin who believed that we weren't created all at once from dust, but had evolved from monkeys. In Sunday school, I would raise my hand and ask about these contradictions. The teacher admired my curiosity, but had no answers. After Sunday school, I would go to church with my grandmother. I would listen to the sermon and sing songs like "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" and "Onward, Christian Soldiers." I especially remember "Onward, Christian Soldiers." They were marching off to war with the cross of Jesus, marching from victory until victory. I loved Jesus, but I wasn't sure I wanted to march off to a war. It could happen, though, any day. It was 1960, and America was in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. In school, we would practice huddling under our desks to protect us in case there was a nuclear attack. I had nightmares that the Russians were invading, and I would have to help defend our school. I knew Jesus was on our side. We began each school day pledging allegiance to one nation under God. The Russians didn't believe in God. I found out how godless they were in 5th grade when I had a new Sunday school teacher, an older woman with a stern face who did not appreciate questions. She declared that one day the communists would invade America, and we would have to be prepared. A communist would point a gun at my head, she said, and ask if I was a Christian. If I said yes, he would shoot me. If I said no and renounced the Lord, like Judas, I would go to hell. She also warned us about Catholics. They weren't as bad as communists, but they probably weren't going to heaven. I tried to be devout. I read the Bible every night. But that same year, I did a bad thing. My friend Stan and I were playing in the alley behind Grandma's house when we saw something buried under a pile of leaves. I picked it up, and it was a magazine, and it had pictures of women. Stan and I stared at page after page. There was a picture of a woman wearing a hat like Roy Rogers and cowboy boots, nothing else, and swinging a lasso. I had never seen anything like this. We couldn't agree on who saw it first, so Stan and I cut up the magazine with the scissors into a pile of individual pictures. We each took half, then traded a few back and forth, like baseball cards. I took my collection home and hid it under my bed. I knew it was a sin. I wasn't supposed to look at a woman with a lustful eye, or I would be committing adultery with her in my heart. I wasn't exactly sure what lust was, but this was probably it. When I looked for my pictures the next day, they were gone. My grandmother had found them and thrown them away. That night, I was sent out to the backyard to burn the trash. I lit a match, and the fire and smoke engulfed the milk cartons, cracker boxes, and my pictures. As I watched the flames rise higher, I thought about the fires of hell. In 6th grade, my dad and I moved from Grandma's house in Minneapolis, and I had to switch churches. I started attending a Lutheran church in Richfield. I asked again about the biblical story of creation and the problem with dinosaurs and evolution. We had a young pastor who said it wasn't a problem. Religion, he said, was concerned with who had created the universe and why, science with how. In biblical days, he said, people explained the world through stories. Some stories in the Bible might be true, but not literally true. It was important to believe that God created the heavens and the earth. Whether it took 6 days or 6 billion years was a matter for science. I shared this information with the mother of a kid on my Little League team and explained that the young pastor was the source of it. He's probably a communist, she said. You know, they're infiltrating the church. It was that year that I began to have serious doubts about the virginity of Mary. I could sort of buy Jesus walking on water and feeding 5,000 with a couple of fish, though these things seemed questionable too. It seemed odd that in biblical times, God had performed so many miracles, yet had done so few lately. I didn't know anyone who had risen from the dead, and if there was a way to change water into wine, my alcoholic grandfather would have surely given it a try. Had God just gotten bored with miracles or said, hey, I've done enough down there. You guys are on your own. Or maybe these miracles weren't literally true. If a virgin had not given birth, how had baby Jesus been conceived? It was clear that Mary's husband was not involved. In the Bible, Joseph knew he wasn't the father. Then who? I figured it must have been somebody, and one day during a boring 7th grade art class, I started writing a short story that theorized how Mary had become pregnant. I modeled her after a 9th grade girl named Ruth. She was pretty with blonde hair and a face like an angel. I adored Ruth from afar. Each time I bought a Baby Ruth candy bar, I would think about her. Then one day, she was gone. There was a rumor that she had become pregnant and had to leave school to stay with relatives in another state. It did not seem unlikely that Mary would have been a bit like Ruth, a good girl gone wrong. I don't remember all the details of my story, but Mary had a thing for an Arab fellow who looked like Sinbad and drank a lot, like my grandfather. When Mary was a few months along, the Arab guy split. She married a guy named Joe, who had always loved her, like I loved Ruth. The story didn't contain any graphic descriptions of sex. In 7th grade, I was vague about the details of that anyway. But my narrative made it clear that God had not supernaturally impregnated a virgin, that Mary had conceived in the same way other girls did. A few days later, my art teacher called me aside. I had shared the story with some friends who passed it around, and somehow she had read it. We'd like you to see someone, she said. His name is Mr. Tuttle. Who's he? I asked. He's the school district's psychologist. I met with Mr. Tuttle in a small, windowless room in the school's basement. I asked why I was here. Your teachers are concerned about you, he said. Well, they're concerned because I don't think Mary was a virgin? I just think some things might be bothering you, some things you'd like to talk about, he said. I talked about my mother and my father. I was having a problem with my father, who was insisting that I be confirmed in the Lutheran Church to please my grandmother, even though my pastor had said it was a personal decision that only I should make. The school psychologist kept looking at his pad and writing notes. I was afraid that he thought I was crazy, that I and my ideas were a danger to myself and others. I knew I wasn't crazy. I had just seen Psycho with Tony Perkins. He was crazy. In 9th grade, I changed schools. I attended St. John's Prep School in Collegeville. It was a Catholic school, and my Lutheran Sunday school teacher would have been appalled. I'm sure my grandmother wasn't pleased. But it was my father's idea. I lacked discipline, he had decided. He wanted to send me away to a boarding school, preferably a military school. But the schools he had been considering were too expensive. St. John's was cheaper. The students at St. John's had always been Catholic, about half of them studying to become priests. But this year, in an experiment, St. John's was admitting non-Catholics for the first time. There was me and a Greek Orthodox kid. When the teachers, most of them monks, invited questions, I would raise my hand. Why had Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," but it also said, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword"? Why did only the Gospels of Matthew and Luke talk about the virgin birth? If it happened, it was pretty miraculous. Wouldn't Mark and John have mentioned it? But there was one question that really got me in trouble. Why would a loving God send people to hell? I asked it of a monk after he'd talked about the devil. He didn't have a good answer. Later, I was called to the headmaster's office. He said I had put the monk in an awkward situation. How was he supposed to answer a question like that? I'd been there about a month when the headmaster told my father that he thought it would be a good idea if I left St. John's. Was I being expelled? No, my father explained. But the headmaster had told him that if I didn't leave voluntarily, St. John's would probably have to ask me to go. That was the end of my religious education. I haven't attended church services for decades. I was married in a church, but that's the last time I remember being inside one. Even so, my religious upbringing is etched in my memory. I like Jesus. I don't know for sure whether he existed, but he's still one of my favorite people. I like so many things he said or is supposed to have said. When I watch the news and I see immigrants fleeing war and poverty to seek asylum in America, I recall what Jesus said in the Gospel according to Matthew. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I don't read it much anymore, but the Bible is still one of my favorite books, along with the novels of Hemingway and Mark Twain. Hemingway said, "All thinking men are atheists." I've met a lot of atheists, most of them smart and more generous than a lot of Christians. Twain was religious, but despised religious hypocrisy. If Christ were here now, there is one thing he would not be, a Christian, Twain said. I am not a Christian, but my Sunday school lessons and reading the Gospels has shaped who I am, for better or worse. I could cast those lessons aside, but I don't want to. I still believe in at least the possibility of a God, or something, and perhaps even a heaven of some kind. No choirs or angels, but if they let my Sunday school teacher in, I bet there's some Catholics and atheists and communists there, and maybe even Charles Darwin, and dinosaurs.